So I think the first question that comes to my mind is, when you look back at American history, there's at least this idealized version where you had these regional elites and they were kind of competing with one another. They were very patriotic. They were investing their capital in kind of building the best museums or train stations and kind of out-competing each other so that the train station in Chicago or the museum in Pittsburgh could rival the one in Detroit or New York. And there was this sort of this sense of, almost a sense of paternalism, right? Where, take a Henry Ford, the workers could afford to actually purchase the vehicle that they were producing. There's a way in which kind of big capital was aligned with the interests of the American nation, the American people, American families. Perhaps that's over-idealized. I'm sure there's all sorts of counter examples. So I think that one of the questions now is there's been more of this kind of realignment with the tech sector. And, if you go back 5 years ago, I think one of the big problems or challenges in America is that the interests of the elites had kind of diverged from the interests of the American people. And so I think we ought, for the sake of our country, to figure out how can we actually realign the interests of capital and the American nation and American workers. So I want to just kind of maybe kick things off with Julius. How do you think about the kind of the tech realignment with reindustrialization and innovation actually happening here in the continental United States?
Yeah, thank you. I'm tempted to turn to Mike for the history as the foundation, but I'll give it a shot. For me, the key element here is that if you look back at this idealized past, 1950s, 1960s. In this case, we'll leave the pre-war stuff for later in the discussion. But basically, at that time, you had the most profitable companies were the largest employers and the largest capital investors. Big integrated manufacturers, Ford, GM, GE in its heyday, companies like that. IBM, much different company than actually producing physical stuff. And what happened, over the course of the 70s and 80s for all kinds of reasons is basically you had a shift to an intellectual property dominated economy where the major companies were able to capture the intellectual property rents and essentially control their supply chains, exert direct control or indirect control via these intellectual property holdings through their sub-suppliers and their labor forces and so on. So you basically had this economy reshaped around capturing intellectual property and financial rents. So what you've had, and now this may be changing a little bit in recent years, but what you had defining the kind of neoliberal economy or 90s economy, software economy, whatever you want to call it, is that the most profitable companies had actually very small employer footprints and very limited needs for capital reinvestment. This is Apple, designed in California, made in China. All the capital investment, most of the labor is outside the US, and the intellectual property profits are captured here by a smaller and smaller group of people. And that creates all kinds of issues macroeconomically and politically, where all these profits are captured by a narrower group. Regionally, areas are getting hollowed out. And of course, from a national security perspective, the industrial base in general and the defense industrial base in particular are getting, frighteningly eroded. So that's what I would define has been the problem, the fissured economy in the academic term. And what we're seeing recently, I think, is the beginnings of a rethinking of that. I would say it's being driven in part or mainly by the national security side, concern over competition with China. But I think there's also a larger macroeconomic aspiration to it. And last thing I'll say is just, in very recent years, a lot of the most ambitious tech people in Silicon Valley, investors in Silicon Valley, have wanted to invest in hard tech, have wanted to make things. And you've also seen with the rise of AI, just a much more capital intensive mode of production or profiting. So you have all these companies, Microsoft, for example, defining what it meant to be a capital light software intellectual property company, now pouring billions and billions into capital investments and down to vertical integration of energy. So these shifts are all underway. I think they'll be the decisive elements of the next several decades, and how that plays out will define a lot of our politics and what this country looks like going forward.
I guess I agree with all of that. I would put a slightly more colloquial spin on it, maybe, which is that I think the intellectual property element is really important. It's one of several things that are going on, though, that all contributed to the fact that once upon a time, if you wanted to earn a lot of money in Cincinnati, you need to run a company in Cincinnati, employ people in Cincinnati, and live in Cincinnati. And as a result, everything else almost flowed from that. I think it's a real, is there a culture of patriotism and paternalism? Maybe a little bit. At the end of the day, they were so focused on the quality of the opera in Cincinnati and the quality of the train station in Detroit because that's where they lived. These same people now are obsessed with donating to the Met in New York City and whatever in London. But they have all left for those few concentrated places. And so the alignment that used to exist was there was actually a mutual dependence between the people with the ideas trying to earn all the money and the people who were going to be both the consumers and producers of stuff. And partly because, as Julius described, in sort of the nature of stuff we consume, you could disaggregate the intellectual property. Partly because of financial engineering, you could disaggregate. Partly because of technology, you could disaggregate management from operation. For all sorts of reasons, you can now move to other countries entirely. You, of course, also have the immigration element where if, heaven forbid, you do actually have to do something in a place in America, don't worry, just complain long enough and we will give you a cheap exploitable person from elsewhere to do it. And all of those work against any actual alignment that you were describing that ultimately I think you need if you want democratic capitalism to work.
I mean, is there something about, and I'm not saying the Carnegie Library was there as a giant marketing scheme for U.S. Steel, but I think to kind of build on your point about connection to community, is there something about connection to your customer too? And you even see that even with corporate philanthropy today, where they are still investing in things, or they're highly personalized philanthropies of, Chan Zuckerberg putting their names on things. Part of it is building a brand. Part of it is kind of marketing to your customer base. And I'm struck to some extent about a lot of the shift in terms of what you described in the 90s. That connection between what's made and who consumes it locally also split a little bit as well. There's also a bunch of stuff that has to do, from my perspective, around how labor was at the table in the 50s and 60s and sharing in some of those resources. But those were your employees, to your point in Cincinnati. They were also your customers. And as you get to a more financialized economy, something that's more dependent on software and whatnot, that is maybe two steps removed from the direct consumer in some respects, is the impetus or that connection to giving back and being a part of or in the same tent, is that something that has to be rebuilt as well? And I'm optimistic for the reasons that you're saying that could be the case. But I think there's something to sort of a more narrow self-interest in some of that moment you described.
I think it's self-interest and also self-image. Part of the philanthropic stuff that CEOs used to do, some of it was marketing, but some of it was the stories that rich people were telling themselves. Because, rich people and entrepreneurs and business owners, they're people like the rest of us. And at the end of the day, you ask them in 1960, why are you donating to the Cincinnati Opera? The actual reason is a little bit self-interested. It's because I'm trying to recruit managers to my company and their wives won't agree to move here unless we can have some kind of culture in our city. But they, in terms of what they tell themselves, it's because I'm a philanthropist and I care about my community. You had the same thing going on in the 90s in the heyday of globalization. You ask, why did so many companies outsource all of this labor and move all of their manufacturing to the third world? Some of it is because they were chasing profits and it was more profitable to go where labor was cheapest. But it's also because they were all telling themselves a really noble story. I am part of the new era of globalization, and I am lifting people in China out of poverty. If we raise 30 people in China into the middle class and 5 people in America fall back down into the lower class, I think that's a good deal. A CEO was quoted in The Atlantic as saying almost exactly that. Mm-hmm. So they were able to think of themselves as part of a noble narrative, and that's why globalization went down the way it did in the 90s. Now, I think that is less appealing. The sort of confrontation with China has taken the sheen off of this rosy story of how globalization was lifting the whole globe out of
Being
poverty.
a global company was like something to market.
Right.
Well, I think-
Whereas
I think
now
it's-
they're excited about we're going to rebuild America. We're going to make
Yeah,
America
yeah.
strong. I think that's the way that rich people and people who run companies now can feel good and proud of what they're doing. I think that's a positive development.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important not to skip an intermediate chain between the regional companies and the global companies. And that was the nationalization of the economy, really after World War II. And it was in that period that you might have had a local company that was founded in Cleveland, Ohio. But thanks to the airplane, where you could send vice presidents across country in a few hours, to visit different subdivisions, different plants. Thanks to the telephone, long distance telephone, it was expensive then, but the business could afford it. You could disaggregate the company, and the headquarters, many of them did move to New York City or maybe to Chicago. At the same time, there was no great love of labor apart from the pressure from the federal government and the unions. And so a lot of these companies transferred their factories in a foreshadowing of globalization to the anti-union South and Southwest, right? And so I see the period from 1945 up until the 80s and 90s as kind of a dry run for globalization, and it would have been globalization then, except for the actions of other governments, because the ex-colonial countries were protectionist. They had import substitution protectionism in Latin America and later on in other parts of the world. And a third of the human race was under Marxist-Leninist autarkic regimes. So to my mind, globalization was always a geopolitical possibility. And I think we make a mistake when the fact that the IT revolution and globalization took place simultaneously. We think, well, one caused the other. Charles Beard, the historian in the 1930s, warned that if we had global free trade, companies would shut down their factories and then open up new ones in poor countries. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, Hamiltonian Republican, was making the same case in 1900s. So my view of globalization is it's essentially labor arbitrage. It's offshore, but if you could do it within the country, then you move things from Connecticut or Ohio to Mississippi or South Carolina. But once other countries, and this was kind of a fluke of history after the end of the Cold War, the import substitution countries decided, well, we'll switch, right? We'll essentially engage in the smokestack chasing, which American states in the South had done for 50 years before. You say, if you invest in our country, we'll provide you with this cheap non-union labor. And then the ex-communist countries opened up for investment. And so, but think about if that had not happened. What if Cold War I, as I think we should describe it now, had not ended? Right? What if Latin Americans still had import substitution, right? And there was no access to Chinese labor? Or I think we probably would have had the same computer revolution, but we would have lots of automated plants in Detroit right now instead of factories in China.
Yeah. Mike, I'm wondering is it possible to have an empire on a global scale, right, in sort of the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War, and not have the labor arbitrage and outsourcing? Because, I mean, if your enemies, if you're in a great power competition and your enemies go belly up, like, it's generally a good thing, right? I would say it's better than being in a Cold War situation. So can you be a global hegemon militarily and not have the capital kind of following the same path?
Well, we will have de facto empires called trading blocks in the future. What made the American version unique was it was dominated by the short-run interests of capitalists rather than by politicians and military planners and so on. So historically, empires have been mercantilist. They wanted to monopolize the high value-added, high-tech manufacturing, and then they would coerce the colonies into buying it, right? So the colonies provide a larger global market, and in some cases, cheap labor. The really fascinating thing about the U.S. is It did what, to my mind, only Japan did in Manchuria. Japan opened up a lot of factories in the 30s and 40s in Manchuria to exploit the cheap labor. But other than that, most imperial hegemonic countries have insisted on keeping the high-tech value-added manufacturing at home. And they want to import raw materials and commodities and minerals from the periphery.
I think this is, I'll be the economic ideology guy. Because I think this, both to Mike's point and what Helen was saying earlier, I do think a huge element of this was this idea that this actually was going to be good for everybody. That I think you're right. There are people who said, like, yes, if I raise up 30 Chinese peasants and lay off 5 American workers, that's a good deal. But generally speaking, the rhetoric was, no, the 5 American workers are going to get better jobs. And to what extent that was like purely pretextual versus they actually did believe it. In my experience, most of them at least like really convinced themselves that they believed this. And as a result, that economic theory trumped politics. Like everyone says you can't define neoliberalism. If I were to attempt to define neoliberalism, it would be to have such faith in this market process to generate good outcomes for everybody that the politicians have to take their hands off and not apply any judgment or constraint to it. And so you actually had, from the political perspective, this bipartisan consensus that obviously we should just stay out of this. This is great. When, of course, you could have had a protectionist empire. And from the perspective of the capitalists, they had really convinced themselves that this was, in fact, the highest calling. I mean, I don't know if anyone ever had the pleasure of hearing the Arthur Brooks pitch when he was the head of AEI. Julius has heard the Arthur Brooks pitch. It was very effective. It literally told, rooms full of like hedge fund managers that, forget about the person actually employing people or building an opera house or whatever, like their high frequency trading was truly the, key to raising people out of poverty. Because what does somebody in poverty need? They need a job. How do you create jobs? Capitalism. How do you make capitalism well? Deep liquid financial markets. Thank you, hedge fund manager. And like standing ovation. And that perspective from the capitalists combined with that perspective from the politicians, I think gave you this world where it was just assumed, well, if we're making a lot of money, it's going to be great, even though that alignment that you started from wasn't there anymore.
I'm intrigued, and maybe both of you can hit on this kind of space and your point around, the neoliberal push in the post-war era, or how even the system we set up was driven by, capitalists at their core, not politicians or war planners. It grew out of the moment where arguably the US was the most centralized plan, to your point, the development of the national corporate, the war effort, the mobilization. And it took place in parallel with this adversarial confrontation with the Soviet Union. How did this, to your point, was it purely ideological to confront an enemy that basically positioned itself in terms of an ideology completely the opposite, so it was convenient? But or was it a backlash to wage controls, implementation of a lot of labor peace issues during the war to keep the war effort going? How did this grow out of that moment?
Well, I think we have to actually complicate it further.
Please.
Because a lot of this stuff began in the Cold War as a way to keep the Western Cold War bloc together. The U.S. turned a blind eye to German and Japanese protectionism and industrial policy. And then, as early as the 70s, American Affairs published a fascinating article about like the early textiles and glove manufacturing chicanery that occurred in U.S. trade and under the Carter administration to allow, the Chinese to basically adopt unfair trade practices. This was all motivated by, foreign policy goals. And that, I think, there is a crucial difference here between, I think, yes, globalization could have it did happen prior to the software revolution and whatever. But it's when through change in intellectual property, when you didn't actually have to make the product to control the product. I mean, in the past, under previous antitrust regimes and so forth, if Apple let somebody else make its phone, it couldn't control like the pricing and the markets and distribution and everything like that. That all started to change in the 70s and 80s. The fact that Nike, didn't attempt to make anything and actually just designed it and outsourced it to Asia, early on, 80s. And they were very successful at that. And we should be, I don't deny the ideological elements at all, but there was a very real pressure that once companies started doing this and they became more profitable as a result, whether that was to China or even to Germany and Japan before that, their competitors had to follow suit, or they would face market pressures, which only accelerated after the financial revolution. And if you didn't adopt the Nike model, private equity is going to come after you and force you to do it.
We hope you're enjoying Project Cosmos, conversations on the future of civilization. If you'd like more content like this, please like and subscribe or sign up for our newsletter, the Intercollegiate Review, in the comments section.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and I agree with what Julius said. Globalization really starts in the 1980s and 1990s. There'd been some maquiladoras on the Mexican border, and baseballs were made in Puerto Rico and so on. But the offshoring was to Germany and Japan. And this is another weird thing about the post-war World War II American bloc, or empire, if you want to call it that. In order to keep the second and third greatest industrial capitalist powers on our side in the Cold War, every president from Truman and Eisenhower all the way up to Reagan, whenever an American lobby was threatened by Japanese mercantilism or the more subtle mercantilism of the Germans, the Commerce Department would defend the company, and then the State Department and the Pentagon would weigh in and say, no, we need them on our side. We don't want to upset, And the fear was not that Germany and Japan West Germany would become communist. It was that they would become neutral, right? And then their industrial bases would be the arsenals for the Soviet Empire. So it was not that the radicals would come to power in Bonn or in Tokyo, but that these very conservative German and Japanese prime ministers would go do trade deals in Moscow. And so, but you're quite right. So within that Cold War bloc, which we called the free world, although it included lots of unfree countries. Yeah, so there was, but that just shows you it was a geopolitical logic. It was not commercial.
Was it the right geopolitical? I mean, because as you're unpacking, was that the right move? I get that it was bad for the industry.
I think it was mistaken, and I think that we see, thanks to President Trump's recent actions about rebalancing the division of labor, that I think the danger of Japan and West Germany even becoming neutral in the Cold War was greatly exaggerated. But there's quotes from President Johnson, from President Eisenhower saying, if the Europeans are not completely self-reliant in NATO in 10 years, we should just get out, right? So I think it was a mistake. However, it was different from the mistake made by the U.S. after the Cold War, which was offshoring things to Latin America or to, Malaysia instead of to Mississippi and South Carolina. Now, China is fascinating because it is simultaneously Cold War Japan and Cold War Mexico, or Puerto Rico, actually. It was simultaneously a low-wage country, but also a very sophisticated mercantilist, techno-developmental state. So it's kind of a dual challenge that we hadn't faced before.
I would take a more positive view, I guess, of what the U.S. did in the Cold War era, in part because it worked. I think we have to sort of credit at the end of the day that it did win the Cold War. And I also think that we got to the 1990s in an extraordinarily strong economic position. I mean, there were certainly problems with Japan and Germany. Reagan had fought Japan on all sorts of fronts. But, we did have a healthy trade surplus in advanced technology products, for instance. The kind of erosion that we saw subsequently hadn't happened in the same way. And I do think that helps to kind of tell the story of how we got to where we were, because there's a way in which, first of all, I think a lot of the aggressive free market ideology started as a response to communism. I mean, it's easy to forget now that like Hayek starts writing because in the 40s, people are looking around saying like, well, obviously central planning is going to be best. How could you possibly hope to compete with Stalin figuring out exactly how much steel every factory should make? And so like Hayek comes on the scene to say like, no, like let me actually explain why the market model is better and you should have faith in it, even if you can't understand it. Then sort of, Milton Friedman comes along and builds this whole sort of argument that also is more kind of philosophical in a lot of ways than actually anchored in any useful economics. And then you get this whole period through the 50s and 60s where like it just looks like it's working. Like, wow, this is great. We do have balanced trade. We have unprecedented middle class prosperity. And so we should just kind of keep doing it. And then the Cold War ends. We're not just a Western bloc anymore. Now, I guess if trade with Germany and France could work, surely trade with China will be great too. And that sort of the logic just keeps going without anyone remembering.
But if China, and this was the hope, if China accepted the deal that West Germany and Japan accepted, which I describe as make cars, not wars, the U.S., and this was called the reassurance strategy under the first Bush administration, the U.S. will continue to police Asia, will continue to police Europe. So there's no need, Bonn and later Berlin and Tokyo and Beijing, to rearm, right? You just make civilian manufactured goods. So there was, I agree with what you're saying, but there was a geopolitical premise there that the U.S. would be the world police cop indefinitely, as far as I can tell, right? And the only geopolitical threats were so-called rogue states and little, kind of weak countries with weapons of mass destruction and terrorists. But there would never again be great power rivalries because all other great powers, other than the U.S., would be civilian industrial powers like post-war Germany and Japan.
Yeah, I just have to say one more thing about this because I just finished a piece on this I found this fascinating tidbit that you get to this point in the late 1990s where there's a single 12-month span. Clinton gives his second inaugural address calling the U.S. the indispensable nation. Paul Krugman writes his column, or I guess it's actually an academic paper at the time, saying the rational strategy is just free trade no matter what anybody else does. Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol write their essay on what they call benevolent hegemony as the role for the U.S. And Tom Friedman publishes his column on how two countries with McDonald's have never gone to war. It's like this exact moment of intellectual hubris and rot that I guess made sense based on everything that had led up to late 1996, early 1997, and then is the starting point of, if you were kind of charting your movie narrative, the starting point of everything that falls apart.
Speaking of intellectual hubris, the U.S. has always seemed to have a strange blind spot where coming out of World War II, we just assumed that U.S. manufacturing and related technologies would be dominant forever. When Vannevar Bush writes Science, the Endless Frontier, he doesn't talk about, manufacturing technology, process technology at all. It's about universities and basic research. And I think there was this assumption that, fine, give Japan and Germany, let them take some market share. At the end of the day, it's a small drop in the bucket. It's not really going to affect any, long-term strategic picture. But already, you have the first kind of waves of the auto crisis starting in the 70s and 80s. Japan comes up with the Toyota method, which really American auto manufacturers still have never quite mastered.
Except in the Japanese plants here.
Well, correct. That was what the solution had to be. So it's just a very strange, I think we may be slowly waking up for it now, but there was, arguably a 50 to 70 year period where we just assumed that the sort of 1930s, 40s post-war level manufacturing dominance in the United States would endure forever and no one would attempt to, challenge that technologically.
I guess in picking up a little bit, I struggle with seeing the whole post-war era as a continuous approach. And I think I kind of agree with your saying. There was something worked for a while. And I have a hard time seeing Japan and Germany in the same playing field as what we're working on with China or what the rapid outsourcing and arbitrage in China looked like. I think because they were serving different political purposes at different political moments to some extent. And I only think it's important to call out those as distinct chapters because I find them both eminently planful, even if they're really about maybe one is a more hands-off, government be an umpire, don't get involved type of approach. Because I think it gives us a lot more insight about what to do next or what kind of the framework is for next. Because there is things that we should look for as not the whole post-Cold War era as a failure. I think there's a lot to learn from pieces of it to incorporate into your broader question, which is, I think technology in some respects, and I'll just say it from the narrow work that I've done around workforce and the impact that change has on workers, having my old job overseeing the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program and the ending of it, which I think I'm the only person that was in that job to see the end of it, where we failed in terms of policies to be able to we'll just reskill people and we'll get them more education when their jobs get traded away. Those are things that were made sense to some extent and helped in the 60s context that made zero sense to work out in the current context. And so I think that re-examination, we should be looking and not kind of saying the whole narrative was a collapse, but what didn't work in that moment versus what could work going ahead.
Brent, I'm wondering if you and I went to Switzerland together on a trip last fall with the American Swiss Foundation, and kind of one of the things that we noticed is the Swiss over and over kept saying, we have no industrial policy, but there's sort of a majority of their economic kind of output is manufacturing, and so what we kind of came to the conclusion is kind of their investment in the workforce is their industrial policy in the sense of the apprenticeship program there. So I'm wondering, what is the piece of kind of actually investing in people here through education, through apprenticeship that could help realign things?
The fair warning to my colleagues is everything will come to apprenticeship to me at some point, and I will try to avoid that but I'll even kind of open it up by saying, and I think these are things you've written too, I've seen you read in the past, Michael, is what the Swiss have figured out is that they have linked education and workforce investment to their industrial priorities. And so they have created a scheme by which industry itself is not just a consumer of talent, but it's a co-producer of it. The setting of industry is a key learning environment. And they subsidize and create the conditions that don't leave each firm to figure that out alone. 70% of Swiss 16-year-olds are going to an apprenticeship. It's basically the inverse here in the United States. Without going too deep in the Swiss system, I think that a lot of a healthy conversation, to your point about this moment, that there's some rethinking of how the US is thinking about its industrial priorities and policies. Our education and workforce system is still heavily trapped in a neoliberal moment. We rely heavily on this idea that everybody basically gets an education and training voucher, and they'll kind of find their way to their degree, and they'll get a great degree and a great job because they have perfect information about how to get there, and firms know what exactly they need, when they need it, and it's this very throw it out there and have everybody figure it out. You go to Switzerland and it's just much more structured. The critical industries know what signals they need to provide to education and training. They know what is needed when, and most importantly, they're closer to the technology.
Well, a question about that. Because I don't know the Swiss system, but it sounds a lot like the German model. In the U.S., we've assumed as you say, you give students vouchers or loans. They, on their own, will have to ask their parents or a high school counselor, what do they think the industries will be 30, 40 years from now when they're middle-aged? Who knows? It always seemed to me that the logical approach is the hamburger university approach. That is, McDonald's has a hamburger university. I know two graduates of it. Well, they're not really graduates. They got honorary degrees as consultants and activists. But they will take promising managers at McDonald's franchises and take them for a few months to their campus. I think it's in Chicago. It's somewhere in Illinois. And, learn how to be managers and the technology and all of that. Why wouldn't it be better for the government to pay the companies to decide and it can be short-term skills, it's not lifetime, but on the condition that they employ or have some kind of contract of a few years. Because my understanding is part of the problem with worker bargaining power in the U.S. now is companies insist on having exactly the right skills with the employee on the resume. And in a tight labor market, you can't do that. You have to retain your workers and then train them. So even in the absence of the tight labor market, is it possible to route, has this been discussed, to route training through the employers?
So I want to thank Mike for that passionate endorsement of American Compass's main workforce training proposal. I think that's exactly right. And the way that I always think about it is looking at our community colleges as at once like one of the best assets we have in the country. I mean, they actually still are everywhere, out in the communities, in rural places, but also as one of our least effective institutions in terms of the actual data. And there are some excellent ones, but in aggregate, completion rates, incomes after going are just, you probably shouldn't go. And the fundamental problem is exactly what you just described, which is that the customer of the community college is like the kid who doesn't know what he wants to do. And that doesn't create, with a big subsidized check attached to his head. That's not a good system for anybody. If you instead, exactly as you said, make the employer the customer, if you say, no, the check comes attached to, you actually have an attachment to an employer, the employer decides what to do with that. If you are McDonald's, you can set up your own hamburger university. If you see Toyota does this also. I mean, in any industry, if you're big enough, you would do that. If you're smaller, you can go to the community college and say, hey, here's what I would actually pay for. You can do that in partnership with other organizations. You can partner with labor unions, but routing the resources through the employers who actually have some sense of what is needed, not to the young people who have no idea what is needed, I think would be much more effective.
I think the only friendly amendment to Hamburger University or for Senator Cotton on the American Workforce Act is it's hard to organize that at the firm level, firm by firm. And I think that's the secret sauce at the end of the day.
Doesn't this require you to have waivers from antitrust? Because the German model is they have a cartel.
It's the chambers, yeah.
Basically, right? And if you're an individual firm and you invest in training your worker, then you worry the worker will quit and go to your competitor. If I think it's the German, let's say chambers, they all the employers in an industry pay into it, and that way they don't lose the money, and plus the government and so on. But so ironically, given the enthusiasm for antitrust on parts of the right and parts of the left, you would actually have to allow a kind of industry occupation specific cartelization or consortium.
And that exists. I think that, I don't think antitrust rules get in the way of that. I think it's actually closer to the two fundamental problems the first one you named, the moral hazard of investing in training in the US. There's not this shared skin in the game approach. In Britain, they have the skills levy as an example where...
What is that? Can you explain?
The skills levy is a universal payroll tax for all employers that employers get back if they train. If they do a qualified training program, they get it back. If they don't, they've paid and cross-subsidized the employers that do, because the idea could be the labor market is mobile. If I'm investing in training, that might ultimately benefit my competitor, but at least my near-term costs are offset. I think there's different schemes for achieving that. And in the US context, I'm not sure a universal payroll tax on employers of all would have the political viability. I'd love to see some states try it. But I think the other thing in the US context is, let's just say this, our trade associations are not as mature or invested in this. They'd much rather work on kind of enterprises around policy versus workforce organization. And I think that's a secret ingredient. But there's also the short-termism. There's I'm much smarter people around here to deal with this, but the view of quarter to quarter workforce and labor is still seen as a cost, not an investment on a company's outlay. And so when you are looking at quarter to quarter, workforce investments take time to pay back. They do pay back, but on average years, not months. And that's just a real barrier to get the big companies back in that training game that I think we have to look at.
Michael, when did, as the historian here, when did that quarter to quarter kind of mentality really set in?
A former executive at IBM who was there in the 60s and 70s and 80s told me it was actually when the executives began being paid stock options. Because before then, I mean, I'm just telling you what he told me. I wasn't there. Before then, you got a nice pension from the company when you retired, and you got a gold watch, and you moved to La Jolla and played golf and all of that. But you were invested for your retirement in your company. But once it became stock options, right? And then there developed and Julius would know more about this than I would, and maybe other people here, there became a market in CEOs, which was a development of the late 20th century. That is, a lot of the CEOs had worked their ways up through the company. There was an internal recruitment. So when you got the combination of these two things, you had these big companies out trying to outbid each other with the most compensation packages, which were largely stock options, not the salary. These superstar CEOs who would come in for a few years, and guess what else started happening at that time? You started having stock buybacks, which Oren can correct me, but I think that was actually illegal.
Yeah.
Right.
So Reagan SEC rule change. Why should the insiders at a company get to decide when to buy its stock? Yeah.
So the superstar comes in, maybe engages in asset stripping of the company, dismantling it, selling it, or maybe buys back the stock, but just gooses his or her stock options, and then either goes to another company, often in an industry knows nothing about, didn't work your way up in, or just retires, now that you're rich.
Yeah. And by the way, fun punchline. I have to shout out my friend. I won't name him, but he'll be delighted I'm making this point. He works in the investment industry, and he said, actually, the stock buybacks and the stock options are closely connected. What you increasingly see companies doing, they're buying back all this stock. Number of shares outstanding aren't actually declining. They are in parallel issuing massive stock options and grants to their executives and then conducting buybacks, so that they're essentially just laundering cash compensation out to executives without it having to show up as salary. Fun for all involved. But I do think we should at least interrogate a bit, as they say, the cultural side of some of this also, because Helen wrote a fantastic piece on the death of the summer job. And, if you talk to employers about, skills gaps and so forth, skills gap doesn't mean I can't find someone who can program a robot. It means I can't find someone who understands what it means to show up on time every day for work, typically. And I don't know what the Swiss and the Germans, timely people, as far as I can tell. That's not a scientific assessment. But you could say, to what extent did the economic changes cause these cultural changes and so forth? It does seem to me that that's kind of a part of the problem with where we are at this point.
And I think one word that has not come up yet in our conversation about workforce development is immigration. But I feel like that's a huge part of the story here, especially if you're talking about STEM fields. Foreign-born workers and immigrants are a huge part of the workforce. I think 1 in 4 STEM workers is foreign-born. In something like computer programming, it's 4 out of 10. They're a huge part of the labor market here in the United States, and that has an effect on wages. We were talking about how young kids choose what field to go into, and a lot of them don't know. Even the ones at 4-year schools don't always know. Well, one way that they make that choice is they look and see who's making a lot of money these days. They say, well, computer programmers, that seems to be a good gig. I'll wager, gamble my future on getting a PhD or a BA in computer programming. But if H-1B visas are suppressing the wages of computer programmers by 20% or 30%, then an 18-year-old kid choosing what field to go into is going to say that no longer seems like a really good bet. And so our best and brightest are going to go into finance instead, or go off and become lawyers as opposed to going into the fields that are actually going to build things for America. So if you want to incentivize people to pursue challenging STEM studies that will actually help build things in the world of atoms, a good way to do that is to make salaries high. And if you want to do that, I think you need to reduce reliance on foreign-born visa workers.
That's a really good point. Julius, I'm curious if you see kind of in your work, obviously, the kind of the tech and the venture community is getting behind the kind of Made in America agenda, especially as it relates to like defense tech in light of competition with China. Are they also getting on board with kind of tightening the labor market, reducing visas to better support American workers, or is that still like a tough pill to swallow?
Yeah, I want to say a couple things. I mean, first on the cultural stuff, I think some of the most interesting scholarly work happening now kind of involves this sort of culture or sociology of manufacturing. There's a wonderful book by a guy at Dartmouth, I believe, Stefan Link, called Forging Global Fordism, that talks about the kind of birth of Fordist mass production out of the kind of machining culture of the upper Midwest that, of course, grew out of the unique agricultural circumstances there. And there's a lot, to really do manufacturing well, you have to have pretty good class relations at some form, or at least advanced manufacturing at some form or another. Because you have to get all these different parts of society to coordinate at some level. So I think the cultural aspects of the workforce are very important and underappreciated. Since we've been talking about, kind of the roots of these things in the 80s and things like that, I feel it's worth explaining a little bit how these policy choices that in retrospect seem huge mistakes at the time seemed reasonable or at least plausible strategies. And I think we have to admit that, unions in America dropped the ball for much of this period. We had a great piece in American Affairs written by some former senior UAW guys talking about, the shift toward kind of pattern bargaining and the elimination of plant-by-plant competition, which took away a lot of the incentives for productivity and removed a lot of, but the interesting thing they pointed out was like during this time, the most combative plants in terms of the most kind of labor disruptions and strikes were the most productive plants. Once you started leveling that playing field or leveling those pay scales, it really took away a lot of the participation for workers in productivity. And the fact is, like, from 70s and on, these old line unionized companies we're losing market share, and not just because Japan or later Korea and China were competing on price. They were competing on price, but they were also advancing in technology. They were just out manufacturing us better technology and so on than us. And the natural home, or at least a major player for this kind of employee training, really should be unions. They don't have this employer problem with competitors and those kinds of hazards. And I think American unions, totally reasonable for them to want to get paid for productivity. And it's a problem that this country failed to do that, in my view. But I think the union and the worker side failed to address those productivity challenges as ambitiously as needed to be done at that time. And that opened the door for some of these more predatory or just unfortunate financialization changes to address the sclerosis and problems of corporate America in the 80s.
Yeah, it's actually a great point about, we're talking about kind of things that we sort of lulled into a false sense of security in the 50s and 60s. I think one of these was the labor movement's attitude that, like, not only was it capital and policy taking for granted that this just works, and labor, I think, also took for granted that we're just the dominant producer. We can just sort of essentially, while resisting a lot of innovation, extract ever higher rents. And that became a very self-defeating strategy. The flip side is, though, that labor is not incompatible with very high levels of productivity growth. I think that, the piece on what they called productivity bargaining is a perfect example. In the German context, the unions famously specifically hold wage growth below productivity growth to ensure the global competitiveness of their output. I just saw SK Hynix, one of the big semiconductor companies that's recipient of the CHIPS grants from Korea. They just announced a big new deal with their union to give workers a higher profit share because unionization is not incompatible with high-end chip manufacturing. TSMC has found that in Arizona. It took them a while. To Julius's point about class relations, the way we've been doing it has become incredibly toxic. But the flip side is it has also turned out that it can be a very constructive element of doing this stuff well. But it's yet another area, both on culture and policy, where we have a very long way to go relative to places we see it done well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to come to the beyond the kind of firm by firm piece, which I will say, to your points of where labor being at the table to extract gains, but also as the principal entity that could be organizing a lot of training and productivity enhancing activities, that at the end of the day is a bargain that has to happen. And I think without kind of contesting too much against, although I have different thoughts on this about the balance of that table to bargain against, given some of the structural things that were happening, I think this point about things like TSMC as an example, or reindustrialization overall, is a huge opportunity to kind of unfold. You're talking about multiple layers of not just society, but the workforce that it's going to take to get mobilized against these areas. That's a huge opportunity for a unifying moment, but it's also an opportunity to be saying there's fundamental rethinking on all these areas, whether that's the trades, to how we are going to build these things, the people who are going to operate them, and who are the engineers and the technicians that are really going to kind of drive the operations of these and the actual products. I don't think we have had a national conversation about how to mobilize against those ends, because there hasn't been a conversation about what are the sectors that you're supposed to prioritize in these things for some time. Creating then spaces for people to slot into and be a part of those conversations, which I think is what TSMC has been working through piece by piece in Arizona, is a unique moment. And I think it dances with this idea of some of these other occupations we've substituted out or not thought about bringing to the table, including like engineering and H-1B visas. So I guess I'm interested to some extent, like the openness to where that conversation happens. I think there's a consensus that it should happen. Maybe I'm wrong. Tell me I'm, at least maybe amongst us friends here. But where does it happen? And Germans and these other countries have sectoral level conversations and bargaining, quite frankly, that get out of the firm by firm, have spaces for that. I don't know what our space is yet.
Yeah, and I realized I forgot to answer your question about the kind of new industrial tech companies. I mean, just to take a very public example, Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, most successful U.S. manufacturing companies of recent decades. We'll bracket everything else about Elon Musk for now, but
and selling Tesla's future to China.
But nevertheless, if you're looking for American extremely distrustful, probably could fairly say hostile to unions. And I think that attitude is not uncommon. That said, and this is where precisely your negotiation point comes in, workforce training, all those are key issues. So I think there is an opening to have both sides come to the table and talk about this. But I think we probably need a kind of different union leadership and conversation, more focused on productivity. And then I think you'll see some willingness from the company side to, pay for what they get.
I don't think you can revive the system established in the National Labor Relations Act of enterprise bargaining. This means you can't unionize Amazon or Tesla. You have to unionize particular factories. Now, that made sense when there were the big three and there was one Ford, giant company, and steel came in one end, car came out the other. It broke down already before the end of the Cold War with outsourcing, different functions, and now you have supply chains around the country, around the world. We've got about 6% of the private sector workforce is unionized now, right? Most union workers are in the public sector. So I think it has to, well, two things. It has to be rebuilt from scratch, but there cannot be a one-size-fits-all labor relations system or
So
apprenticeship
you believe in
system.
letting states and locals pilot different approaches?
No, I think depending on the sector, if you assume, as I do, that Cold War II will continue for decades or generations, probably, and then even after that, there will be a brief armistice before Cold War III and Cold War IV and Cold War VI and V. So the national security tech sector, there, I think the federal government is within its rights to mandate some kind of sectoral bargaining within that sector. If you get defense dollars, then you're going to have this. Now, it won't necessarily be an adversarial plant-based system, but they can mandate this. Now, this is more likely to come from Democrats than Republicans at this point. If it's the nursing home sector, which is difficult to organize, there I think state and local wage boards, for example, makes sense because you don't even unionize. You just have people elect some kind of labor representative. And this could be done at the city and county and state level because you're not going to shut down all the nursing homes in a city and then move them somewhere else for cheaper wages. So the employers already don't have that much leverage. But it requires thinking about this in a different way. And just one more point to wrap up. In discussing the kind of Luddite reactions by manufacturing workers, I think it's worsened in the U.S. by the low wages in the service sector jobs, which are the majority of jobs now and will continue to be in the future. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a disproportionate growth in service sector jobs is in healthcare related ones, mostly low end, like health aides and home health aides and nursing aides and so on. Now in Western Europe, these are middle class jobs in a lot of cases. I mean, in even McDonald's jobs are middle class jobs. And I think it's just a factor. But I think one reason why there's this assumption that manufacturing jobs are good jobs, it's because the non-manufacturing jobs, except for the high-end professional ones, are terrible, right? So that inevitably labor-saving technology is going to displace a lot of workers. And I think those workers and their families would be less terrified if there weren't this vertiginous drop in income between being a unionized factory worker and being a nursing aide, right? What if the nursing aides were paid like factory workers, right?
That's the trade story in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's like Helen was saying earlier, no one said immigration yet. No one said tariffs yet, which is a real failure. I had saved my rider. I don't know how we got this far. But I think the sort of protectionist trade policy that we're seeing in the U.S., I think is actually really relevant to this, particularly from the more kind of right of center conservative perspective, because something that I believe very strongly is that the kind of broad, blunt nature of tariffs as a response to what we're seeing going on is really kind of their benefit. Like, I get very nervous about the question of like, where will the national conversation come from? I think you typically see, a lot of, whether it's from the left of center, from the NGO philanthropic world, it's like, what are the like convenings we can hold and the, new institutes we can set up and so on and so forth. And at some point, I actually really believe like, this is what markets are for. Like, and this goes back to exactly where we started, which is like, where is the alignment? I think if we actually said, hey guys, if you want to make money in the United States, you're going to have to find a way to do it with American workers. If you want to manufacture, sell product X in the United States, you're going to have to find a way to do it with American workers in the United States. And now go figure it out. Have at it. And I suspect that maybe this is too Hayekian of me, but I have a lot more faith in that to actually drive behavior and solve problems, as opposed to thinking that we can kind of technocratically solve the problems. And, it seems to me that if you take that approach, then you really do kind of have the luxury of, even when it comes to sort of, which sectors are we focused on, or, what's the right model of labor organizing? It's like, well, I don't know, employers who need to actually figure out how to make this stuff are probably have a real interest in, if the response to, we have a labor shortage is not, let us go find you some more workers, but like, wow, that's really interesting. Excited to see how you innovate. I'd love to see what happens.
We saw this. There's a natural experiment right after COVID when the markets opened up sooner than people thought they would. And it was before mass immigration resumed. And so for, half a year or so, suddenly working class people were able to demand raises, right? And employers had an incentive to retain the workers instead of firing them, getting someone cheaper. At that point, all of the prestige newspapers, the economists, they all said, we need more immigrants to prevent inflation. Well, how would more immigrants prevent inflation? Oh, by suppressing wages at the bottom. So I agree with Oren. I think that if we had a prolonged, generation-long labor shortage, it's not zero immigration, but enough to make the shoe tight on the foot of the employer, we'd see a lot more retention and we'd see higher wages. And to the extent that you do have organized labor, it would have bargaining power. And even in the skills, if you have to retain the worker and you can't fire the worker immediately to get somebody from India or China or Europe or, who has exactly that skill you're looking for in the next 6 months, then doesn't that give you an incentive to train the worker?
I guess I'd quote someone named Oren Cass earlier today, but I guess my one question would be like, how could the politics outrun that ideology?
The politics is a huge problem, and I think because Mike's timeline point is really important also, that you can't do this for kind of 3 months, right? And this is one of the things that drives me nuts now is people are like, oh, look, like the survey of manufacturing confidence is lower than it was last month. That proves that tariffs don't work. And it's like, well, I'm not surprised that a company that has done business one way for 25 years is reporting dissatisfaction that the incentives and rules have changed. And by the way, when we did the opposite, when we said like, hey guys, go offshore and lay everybody off, the economists weren't like, oh, wait a minute, next month a bunch of people got laid off. They're like, well, if you wait several generations, this will work out well. There's a very odd asymmetry in what economists will and will not patiently wait for. But the political reality is the same, which is how do you actually stay the course? Because there are costs associated with it. I think they're very worth paying. But then also there's a sort of meta question of how do you convince people you are going to stay the course, because people aren't going to focus on solving these problems, make the investments or anything else if they think the next administration is likely to just come in and do the opposite.
I would say on tariffs, though, you saw in Trump 1, the tariffs on China. I mean, those were largely held in place during the Biden administration, or maybe even expanded in some ways, right? So I think there may be, on this making things in America and the role of tariffs. Obviously, I don't think the Democrats would be as aggressive as Trump is being with the tariffs. But I think maybe there is a bit of a longer term horizon for that. I think the immigration thing is one where that is a little bit more like we're flipping a switch back and forth. And I don't know what it would take to actually get a 10 or 20 or 30 year period where we significantly reduced the flow of immigration so that there could both be economically and kind of greater cultural cohesion and also that economic tightening that we would get wages to.
It's very difficult because most major institutions in the U.S. have restructured themselves since mass immigration really resumed in the 70s and 80s. They've literally restructured their business models. So universities increasingly are dependent on foreign students who usually from rich families whose wealthy parents will pay tuition. And then the universities, we discover now, oh, you can't reduce the number of foreign students, we'll go bankrupt. That wasn't true in 1980 or 1970 or 1960. The big cities have been depopulated since the 1940s. All the New York, Boston, Chicago, they all shrank. between 1945 and the late 20th century. They've expanded their populations only because immigrants are being brought in. As the people born there are moving out to the suburbs and the exurbs in cheaper states. So you have universities, landlords, companies dependent on 75% of the H-1Bs in Silicon Valley are from India, right? And they're overwhelmingly young men. So how did we get from, the original Silicon Valley, where it was dependent for some extent on poor Latinas who would do the work of assembling chips for low wages. But how did we get to this point where they say, an American workforce can't do this? So I don't know the answer to that political problem, because much of the elite, this is their business model now.
I'm really glad you mentioned universities, because they are an underrated villain in this story. A lot of the graduate programs, many graduate fields are 75% foreign-born students, things like electrical engineering. Even economics, I think, is about 70% foreign-born students. And the universities do make a ton of money from this. And it's frustrating to me because people complain we can't find Americans who have these skills. And I think, well, what's the place where we train them to have skills? Can we get some Americans in there? That might be a helpful spot. But it was such a hard slog getting the Republican Party to stand up for American white-collar workers and to recognize that the H-1B visa is doing to white collars what NAFTA did to the working class. It's just a total threat to their way of life.
Do you feel they're there?
Well, that's the thing.
I was just say slog. What's the term for being like neck deep in the middle of the swamp?
The H-1B,
The H-1B
I find to be
war of
very
Christmas
interesting,
last
though.
year.
Right.
Yeah,
I find
what's
it
your
very
take on how that
interesting
played
that
out?
we've seemed to come to this multi-party consensus around, well, skilled immigration is good. And I will leave aside the fact that I wouldn't be here if unskilled immigrants weren't allowed to come into the country. I don't know if you all feel the same way, but the point is, like, skilled immigration could be a good thing. The reality, and this is where I think when you hear a lot of discussions, and you guys can tell me I'm in the right room where this is wrong, but I hear that from my friends on the other side of the aisle a lot. What I can say is the H-1B program, to your point, the largest users are not American companies. They're Indian-based arbitrage firms that outsource, that actually source contracted H-1B visas to consultants. So they're using, the entire companies are built on the back of the H-1B program. And I have long said, it is supposed to be a temporary program. It is supposed to be a program where you're filling a skilled need. We have never done anything in that program outside of collect some fees here and there, which is nothing to invest in the American workforce off of it, to actually force it to be temporary. And I think the companies that get in line for that, at the end of the day, have no requirements to actually have a plan or any real intention of, to your point, putting an American white-collar worker in that job. So I don't know where the debate is right now on the right around H-1B. I hear a lot of different things. I'd love to hear some thoughts on it. But it feels to me that it's gone from either get rid of it or it's a good thing, that's the right immigration. Is there something in between?
Well,
what am I missing?
I think that you're right. Up until recently, the consensus, and I contributed to this, and I think I was mistaken, is that, well, we need to reduce unskilled immigration, but we need more skilled immigrants. And what changed my mind about that is the math. So India has 1.4 billion people. If 10% of them are qualified for American professional, technical, financial, engineering jobs, you could fill every single well-paying professional job in the United States with an Indian. That's how big the population is. And I'm not criticizing India. It's popular. It's true. Same with China. We're the third largest country in the world, but we're smaller than that. But you could, with China and India, you could literally replace the entire elite in every job opening with a small fraction of their population. And even if these are still semi-developed countries, if 10% of India is developed in Western class and competitive, that's 140 million people right there, right? I mean, that's bigger than Russia. It's almost twice as big as Germany. And again, it's not an ethnic thing. I mean, it's just the sheer scale. And the other thing is, if we can't, we have to import people from other countries because our people lack the skills, then why didn't these countries do the same thing? I mean, India and China, their development model does not consist of importing tens and hundreds of millions of Americans and Canadians and Europeans. So I'm very skeptical about this argument. I don't believe it. I think the companies are lying when they say that they can't find the Americans. And they're lying. We know they're lying for the reason you point out. They're using labor contractors. Okay, so what they say is, we looked all over. We looked in Idaho, and we looked in Palo Alto. We couldn't find that worker. The top users are like Amazon, Apple, Microsoft. They say to Tata Consultancy or Emphasis, these so-called body shops, they say, we need so many H-1Bs, send them to us. We're not even going to look at their resume, really. I mean, it's just, so the whole thing is a fraud, I think, on the public.
But I truly do think the American people are waking up to this, and the politics of this issue have changed, even just in the last 5 years, right? One of the most important developments in the last presidential election was the arrival of the tech bros into the Trump coalition. Thank you, boys. I'm glad you're here. This is welcome. There was really an advantage to the Trump movement to have them on board. The one downside is I think some of them expected that the benefit they would get from joining the Trump coalition would be, one of their top policy wish list items, which is unlimited H-1B visas, high-skilled visas for the workers that they want. And I think there was an eruption of discussion about this about a month before Trump was inaugurated. I remember it was Christmas break, and so nobody was at work, and everybody was on Twitter talking about H-1Bs. It was great. I was in heaven. But that was, I think, the people who were reciting the same platitudes that have come so easily to everybody's lips for the last 20 years. High-skilled immigration is great. It's what built America, all the rest. They were surprised, genuinely surprised, I believe, by the pushback they got from Americans saying, we love you guys, we're glad you're here, part of the Trump coalition, but this is one policy wish list item we are not willing to give you. That unlimited visas for skilled foreign workers is not something that is going to make America great again. So I think the politics of how that plays out in the next 4 years will be interesting to observe. I hope Trump 2 does many of the same H-1B reforms that Trump 1 did. We'll see. But it is a tension in the coalition.
We're getting back to where this conversation started, which was on kind of the political signal and political durability. I mean, I think whether it's immigration, whether it's trade, pretty much anything, we have to get back to using Congress. And pretty much the only way you can signal that this is here to stay is to pass something through Congress. And I think, the administration, the second Trump administration has maybe overlearned the lessons of the first Trump administration, which was they sort of came in thinking Congress is useless. We're going to do everything by executive order and ignore Congress as much as possible. But it's very different this time around. And, Congress doesn't have its own separate agenda. Paul Ryan's not there anymore. There's been turnover. It's still, the world's finest deliberative body or whatever. There are many different opinions, different factions. But I think the administration could probably get a lot more through Congress than it has attempted to do. And even if it doesn't, having some of those fights would potentially lay the groundwork for a more longer term durable implementation of these political strategies and would probably be worth having.
Do you think it could e-verify through Congress?
I think if the White House leaned into it, it's absolutely a possibility.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like that would, even with the deportation thing, I mean, that would be almost instant, achieving sort of that in a much more organic way.
Yeah, well, I think Julius makes an important point that there are two reasons to try to actually work through the political process. One is to actually pass the law and, cause the permanent change. the political fight along the way is also an end unto itself. And I feel like
What do you mean, but why is it an end to itself?
well, because it actually forces people to take sides and test those positions against the views of the American people who, like, they are in fact still quite accountable to at the end of the day. I think we've ended in this weird place where, like, messaging bill now means this, like, weird, obscure fringe thing that nobody cares about that you file so you can put it in your, ad or a letter to a donor or something. The kinds of bills you should be crafting are bills that are actually substantive and popular and would address real problems. If they can't pass because the other side has some ideological reason to block it, good. That's exactly what you want to be highlighting. And so that's where, like, E-Verify is such a classic example, where if you actually said, look, here, and especially now that Trump's policies have changed the facts on the ground so dramatically at the border, like the old, like, James Lankford sludge thing is just off the table.
What
right?
is the James Lankford sludge?
Sorry, this was the year before, right before the election, when it was like, oh, well, there's such chaos at the border, Republicans and Democrats must come together on this common sense compromise bill. And James Lankford was the Republican who was like, I, as a, self-righteous, upstanding congressperson, like, agreed to this compromise with Democrats, when everybody knew the problem was intentional policy by the Biden administration to create the chaos, and that the actual views of the American people were, please stop the chaos. And sure enough, after the bill failed, the election was coming and the Biden administration stopped the chaos. And then Trump came in and truly secured the border. And so now it's very funny. You still have kind of the immigration activists on the left running around being like, we would like to rediscuss our compromise. Everybody gets something because compromise is like a fundamental value. And it's like, there is no compromise left. The fundamental problem of securing the border has already been addressed. We have shown that can be done with existing law. The question is now, we would be happy to discuss a more rational legal immigration system, but that is not going to include a bunch of concessions on illegal immigration. And so the next logical step is to craft a bill that says, look, enforcement is here to stay. And by the way, I think that element at least is quite politically durable. I think it is very hard to envision another Democratic administration coming in being like, all right, activist groups, like, please tell us how to fuss with the law to let millions of people across the border. That may actually be over, which would be nice.
I don't think they'd message it that way.
What's that?
I don't think they'd message it.
They didn't message it that way last time, and they saw what happened. And so I think if you actually said, look, we are not going back to that world, you can either do enforcement the way it's happening right now, or we could have an enforcement system that's actually harsher on employers, that's based on credibly deterring illegal immigration and forcing those who are here illegally to exit the labor force, to make arrangements to leave. Which would you prefer? Like, that's what you should be bringing forward.
If you have universal E-Verify, I don't think realistically 12 or 15 million or 20 million, whatever it is, illegal immigrants are going to leave voluntarily, even if the government pays for their plane flights. And there, I do not think there's a consensus on the populist or, MAGA right as to what to do if you have some sort of de facto amnesty. You wouldn't call it that, but for these people.
Why don't you think they would? Why don't you think a significant number would leave?
Because it's just the sheer cost of it.
Who would they work? Who would they work? Let's say you were really penalizing the companies that were doing the practice. Who would they work for? Just they'd stay and be paid under the table?
I'm not doing this for the employers. I'm just saying I cannot see the U.S. under any government, Republican or Democratic, like deporting 20 million people within a few years. I just don't see this happening. I think there's going to be some kind of work visa. And Trump has raised this. He has no intention of deporting everybody. They're working on some work visa of some type. I think logically, if they're not all going to be deported, you want to have some kind of remain in place work visa of some kind. But you want a transition to citizenship. If you're a genuine populist, cheating on immigration rules is bad, but having a permanent helot cast for the next century is also bad, or 3/4 of a century. the goal of genuine populists, be they on the right or the left, has to be that everyone who is allowed to work in the United States has identical labor rights. That means no guest workers, no H-1Bs, no H-2As, no indentured servants. You can quit your job at any time and go to work for another employer. It means you can join a union, and it means after some sort of process for the illegal immigrants who are amnestied, that's basically what it would be, and they can pay a symbolic fine. A lot of them are poor; they can't afford more than that, But at some point, you want them to be citizenships. You do not want the ranchers and farmers of America to have a permanent non-citizen workforce of tens of millions of people.
So I agree with your point about the underclass, but I think that you're conflating a few different issues because, first of all, the entire premise of E-Verify is that you don't have to deport 20 million people, that if you are actually enforcing the law and changing the attractiveness of being here, there are many people who will no longer.
Immigration.
Well, it's certainly a deterrent to new immigration. Yeah. There's also a very large share of the illegal population that is either very recently arrived or moves frequently back and forth across the border. So as a starting point, and we should actually go back to there's not even agreement within the Republican Party on E-Verify. I mean, that's a problem too. And you even heard Trump talk about, well, we need lots more temporary worker programs, right? This is all still contested. But if you had an E-Verify program as the kind of non-negotiable starting point, I think that actually gives you a lot of options, because I think you're right. So one thing you can do is initially make it for new hires. This is what Florida did. Another thing you can do is pair it with essentially temporary expiring work permits to say, now that we're putting this in place, everyone doesn't need to be fired instantly. If you're someone who's come into the country in the last few years, here's the sort of period of time for which you could continue to work. That is going to expire. You are going to have to leave. If you have that system working successfully, I think you'd find a lot of openness, even on fairly hardcore elements of the right, to say, look, people who have been here for 5, 10 plus years already, the system is working. Other people have left. Yes, you can have the kind of conversation you want about what to do with that, eventual group if you've solved the other problems. So I think, with the principle we've talked about here, these problems actually are very much solvable. I think the bigger issue at this point is you still have, even on the right of center, even within the Trump administration, a strong faction that hates illegal immigration, but has no interest, apparently, in actually imposing the constraint of a tight labor market. And you're seeing that, you saw that a little bit with H-1Bs. You're seeing it a lot more with temporary workers, seasonal workers. The idea that the plentiful exploitable labor and the cheap price is the end-all be-all that everything else has to form to.
Well, in this connection, I've thought that the immigration debate and family policy are kind of merging, because when all of the other lobbying points about mass immigration are dropped, then the question is, who will take care of our elderly parents and who will take care of our children? Which I find very amusing, because they've now found evidence that the human race is 300,000 years old in its modern form. Maybe it's older. So for pretty much 300,000 years, people took care of their own children and their own elderly relatives.
I mean, so for a while they left the elderly relative under the tree.
Or they had infanticide or whatever. This is always presents the killer argument, right? That who will raise our toddlers and who will, change the diapers on our elderly parents, like everybody up until 50 years ago did. In most societies, unless you were part of the aristocracy and you had the servants doing it. But other than that, the people did take care of their dependents within the family.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the technology theme, there's a lot of people that think the robots are going to take those jobs. But I would, to run with that transition, I think some of the most animated conversations about labor and workforce are no doubt about immigration. I do question whether politically if we're spending a lot of capital and time, to your point, whether it's border issues or what the right level or if any level of temporary worker needs through visa programs in this country is going to take a long time to discuss and debate. Is it the conversation that's the most important about labor and workforce? And I think that the questions around what the impacts of technology are going to be on the potential for great jobs to grow and happen in this new reindustrialized moment, what is going to be the nature of the care economy, which is still a backbone of a lot of employment markets in states across the country. I think I worry if that immigration sucks up more oxygen for the conversation of the next 5 years. Not to say it isn't important and not to say it's not politically important. It's hugely top of the list. When a lot of the questions about what are good jobs, what are the industries that are going to grow, who's going to do what type of work, are very much laced to a lot of what the impacts of technology are going to be on the labor market.
But isn't the impact of technology mainly is not to create more well-paid tech jobs? It's mainly to, if it's labor-saving technology, it shifts labor to the non-traded, labor-intensive sectors that remain. And I check the BLS every few months, and it's updated periodically. There's not a single tech job, I think, in the top 10 jobs in terms of numbers being created. Last time I checked, there were only 2 that required a BA, the top 10, nurse and general manager. It's like the manager at Safeway, right? All the other jobs require only high school education. This is according to BLS. Now, maybe others would dispute this. And some on-the-job training, right? And it's increasingly dominated by low-end, underpaid healthcare jobs. And this is just where I'm a skeptic about the skills, because as far as I can tell, nurses have enough. They have all the skills they need. They're not. And if you pay the nurse more money, or the nursing aide or the home health aide, why would the higher skills lead to more money if their employers have crushed their unions and can import poor people from abroad to do the same job for less? So I think there's a legitimate debate about skills, but I was in Washington for 30 years. The skills debate was used as an excuse to change the subject from how people are paid. And the way people are paid is not a result of their human capital for the most part. It's a result of the bargaining power of the worker versus the employer. So I think when we look, now maybe I'm wrong, but I think the main result of AI will be to accelerate the growth of the non-traded, labor-intensive service sector. It may be new kinds, but there's no reason to believe, in the absence of a tight labor market and some kind of collective bargaining, that these will not be terribly low-wage jobs.
Yeah, I think the immigration issue, this is probably like the number one, issue on the right. For the next decade, I don't think it's going to go away. Like, I think this is, and I also think it's like one of these things that these are the lever, like there's probably a reason why immigration and tariffs are because those are the easiest, we can have all these more nuanced conversations about how to, train the workforce, but these are like the levers that can be pulled almost instantaneously to tighten either the labor market or to tighten, jobs from going overseas. So like, I think that's the fastest way to kind of get to some of those constraints on capital where they can still make money, pursue their self-interest within this kind of American framework, but we can kind of constrain it. But I kind of want to...
Well, and I was trying to move off the subject because actually what I'm saying is like I think always you mentioned the skills gap piece. Someone once said the most important words, and this is true for H-1B, at that wage. There's a skills gap at that wage. Software developer at that wage is a shortage. And so I think there's great allies, obviously, on the left at all sides of the spectrum to involve themselves in this idea that, well, if we had less intensive immigration into these various roles, these jobs would be better, more Americans would want to take these jobs. What I'm just saying is like the principal issue that, if we got to a place where we got a reasonable set of tariffs and this great new renaissance in policies, there's going to be pressures that employers in these tight labor markets will start to deploy technology and ways to substitute those. Yeah. And I'm worried about what our net looks like to support transitions. But
that's the entire point of the technology. I mean, that's the good story. Yeah. Like, one of the funny things is it's often the exact same people complaining that we need much more immigration because of labor shortages, and also that we need, universal basic income or whatever because robots are going to take all the jobs. Right. And the whole formula for a capitalist economy to work well is that you do have a tight labor market. You do need to introduce increasing amount of technology to meet output needs with the labor you have. And then the last piece of it, and this goes to Mike's point, is and also the workers then benefit from that increased productivity and output. And I think I started with this kind of very oversimplified heuristic of how do you make money in Cincinnati. I think there's another very useful heuristic here, which is just thinking about, and it doesn't have to be a factory, it equally applies in services, but just talk about a factory that, produces 100 widgets a day, and you increase some piece of technology that allows you to double the factory's output. And there are three different things that could happen at that point, right? One is you could produce 200 widgets a day and pay everybody twice as much. One is you could produce 200 widgets a day and just pocket a lot more profit. And one is you could lay off half the workers and keep paying them the same amount to produce the 100 widgets a day. Or 110 and just eke out that little quarterly bump that you're looking for. And that's it. With all of this technology we're talking about, even the term labor saving technology applies exactly to this. When you have a labor saving you get these economists who say well, let's separate out the technology that substitutes from the technology that augments. These are, it's the Amy Poehler, it's Pam Beasley. These are the same picture. It's the same thing. The question is, what's the context in which you're introducing the technology? And we should go on continuing to talk about the technology side of it, but just to briefly know why at least I obsess a little about the immigration piece is because as a conceptual matter, it is so fundamental to how we think about these things. We have this model that's oh shoot, where will the labor come from? That the first thing that has to give is not invest in better processes and technology. It's not maybe the price of something goes up because that's what markets are for. It's, oh shoot, where does the labor come from? And it's that mental shift to no, hold the labor constant. Now talk about how our market's going to react and what technology can we introduce. I think that's what we have to get back to.
Yeah, I would go even a little bit further than that at a kind of more political level, particularly on the right, but even beyond that, I mean, immigration is a foundational issue because it's not just about the economics, but it touches on national identity, democracy, all those sorts of questions. And those of us who fancy themselves policy wonks, I think, need to realize that what are these policies for? What is GDP growth for? What is industrial policy for if you can't define what the national interest is? And to some extent, a lot of these economic, it's not just the market that needs to adjust or companies that need to adjust around these realities, but when you're thinking about the policy solutions, a lot of the reason for the industrial policy is to make the desired immigration policy functional, or tech policy and what have you. And I suspect that cultural shift, that fundamental political shift is sort of here to stay.
I want to shift things in a slightly different direction, especially because we have Michael Lind here. So I want to talk about monopolies and also kind of antitrust. This is something I remember even years ago, before I knew you, Michael, kind of emailing Julius and being like, help me understand, because there was this sort of new kind of energy where kind of right and left were agreeing. And I think it was a lot around kind of big tech and the problems with big tech that kind of, trust busting is actually like a good thing. And, okay, let's go back to Teddy Roosevelt. And you have the Neo-Brandeisian school kind of gaining popularity and Alina Khan and sort of like a kind of a left-right overlap on some of this, but then at the same time, you read Michael's kind of robust defense of monopolies. And so I'm wondering if we can, and sort of make, a lot of the people that believe in industrial policy also believe in trust busting, but then how does that relate to kind of competition with China, where they have these national champions? So I'm wondering if maybe Michael can kind of steelman the case for monopolies, and then we can kind of dive into this tension here.
Well, in our book, Big is Beautiful, that I co-authored with the economist Robert D. Atkinson, we didn't defend unregulated or unchecked monopolies. So market power is a problem economically and socially. But what we did was we tried to reconstruct the history of economic thought that was erased by Milton Friedman and the libertarians after the 1960s, which goes back to Edward Chamberlain and Joan Robinson and John Kenneth Galbraith in the 20s and 30s and 40s. All modern industrial societies, there's a distinction between industries with increasing returns to scale or network effects. So the factory that produces more cars on an amortized level more cheaply, the bigger it is, that's increasing returns to scale. The utility grid or electrical grid or railroad, which is more efficient, it has more nodes. And it can be, an online media platform. The more nodes it has, the more useful it is. So increasing returns and network effects encourage, in fact, will lead to market competition will eliminate most firms, and you'll eventually get oligopolies or monopolies. Then there's the sector of perfect competition, of diminishing or constant returns to scale. So a restaurant, for example, a mom and pop restaurant is no less efficient than some restaurant chain. I mean, the chain may have reputational effects or something. So if you have oligopolies and monopolies appearing in the restaurant business, this should make you suspicious, right? Are they doing some kind of nefarious things? If you find that there are a few giant railroad firms or a few big online media platforms or a few giant aerospace companies, not a whole lot of mom and pop aerospace companies, then you would not suspect that chicanery is at work. Having said that, just two points. Joseph Schumpeter, and the Austrian-American economist, argued that you actually need scale in tech firms and in manufacturing firms, because they can, if they use their market power to extract rents, to have these super profits, and they recycle those rents into R&D, then they can actually invent new technologies like Bell Labs in the old days. I mean, the microwave oven and things like that come out of it because they had Bell Labs, which they could not have done in a perfectly competitive market. That is not to say if they recycle their market power-based rents into higher stock options for their CEOs or into buying up unrelated lines of business or whatever. So conglomerates are bad if they're, companies where the managers loot the company are bad. But so that's one thing. And the government has a duty, in my view, to support large firms that recycle their market power rents into R&D, but don't use it for other purposes. And in addition, as Rob Atkinson and I pointed out, you also want what John Kenneth Galbraith called countervailing power. That means you want organized labor, right? So you have these monopolistic, oligopolistic companies. The janitor is not negotiating on an equal basis. One of the statistics we had in the book, Big is Beautiful, is that in the private sector, most Americans are employed in firms with 500 or more workers. Now, you would never know this to listen to all of the stuff about small business. But this is an economy, and has been since for some generations, of very large firms. Does that mean that you don't want antitrust? No, because antitrust can be useful if firms, large or small, are engaged in essentially unfair behavior, in criminal behavior. But on the other hand, if you're talking about industrial policy or technological rivalry, Alfred Chandler showed this was true from the Industrial Revolution onwards. Every country has large oligopolistic or sometimes monopolistic firms in the same manufacturing industries with economies of scale. Sometimes they're state enterprises, sometimes they're private. This is not a result of criminal behavior by wicked people. I mean, it's true in Japan, it's true in Germany, it's true in the communist country, everywhere. So scale is real. And the Brandeisian approach after Justice Brandeis, who literally said there are no economies of scale, or to that effect, that is, all large firms exist only because they're conspiracies. This is just not true. So you have to think of the economy as having two circles. And this was called the core and the periphery by the economic historian Alfred Chandler. The core are these large natural oligopolies and monopolies with economies of scale. And the periphery is all of the mostly service sector, pre-modern, some like craft, artisan businesses. And ironically, since in the history of antitrust in the 20th century, most antitrust cases were taken against plumbers in the competitive sector, right? Because they were having like cartels, secret cartels and things like that. And the Brandeisians would say, well, why aren't you breaking up Boeing, right? Why are you going after the plumbers? And because there was a recognition that if you break Boeing into 15 little tiny Boeings, then A, you lose World War II and the Cold War and with the other industrial powers. But B, if you allow them to merge, then you're going to get one big Boeing again, right? 20 years from now.
Real quick, because I'm sure there's a lot of ways that Oren might agree with some of those things. But I'm wondering, Oren, if you could, just for the sake of presenting maybe a foil argument in favor of antitrust, if you
I don't agree with that generally. I mean, okay. I think the piece of it I agree with is there are plenty of very natural reasons that you'll have big firms. Like one of my favorite examples of how dumb a lot of economics is there's like one of the most revered economists is this guy, Ronald Coase, whose like big insight was this paper he wrote called The Theory of the Firm. Because economists are like, well, in super perfectly efficient markets, why would you have firms at all? Why wouldn't it all just be individuals transacting in the market? And like any logical person would be like, well, because markets aren't efficient and there are all sorts of reasons you want a firm. But economists had to like come up with this bizarre theory of how, well, it's because of transaction costs and contracting costs money. So if we can have the same boss, that would be more efficient. There are lots of reasons you would want to have big firms. The problem, I think, and this is where it's interesting, you hear some people talk about competition policy instead of antitrust policy, is you have the benefit of scale on one hand and the benefit of competition on the other. And so the kind of like, well, let's break Boeing into 15 little Boeings sounds unattractive. The question, I think, is would you rather have one Boeing or three? And on one hand, you see... look at TSMC in Taiwan or Huawei, like these economies that succeed with this one national champion. In the US context, I think it's safe to say we have done better before you get to that point. That actually airplane manufacturing industry certainly innovated a lot more and seemed to, frankly, build safer and more competitive planes when there were Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, and it wasn't literally one company. I think, we were talking earlier about the old Silicon Valley, and you could say like, well, surely Intel will be the more efficient and innovative company that can, has the scale and can recycle all of its profits to R&D. Empirically, it's just not true. We had a much more innovative and effective semiconductor industry when, yes, they were smaller, but they were firms with a very strong incentive to invest and innovate and beat each other's throats. And I think you see the same in big tech today, where you have companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook. You know, AI is kind of the first interesting example of like, oh, is that something really new and innovative? It is telling that I think most people would say the leading lab on that, OpenAI, actually started as a very small nonprofit consortium. If you look at what like Google Labs, you know, they famously brought in a high-powered CFO to manage these, you know, hundreds of billions of dollars essentially in cash that they needed to deploy. And we're just like throwing around and wasting on random stuff that accomplished nothing because, in fact, a giant company with market power that can print cash doesn't tend to actually, I think, invest.
So Oren and I agree. There are natural oligopolies. I'm not defending monopoly per se. And indeed, the essence of Schumpeter's theory of technological innovation was that competition among natural oligopolies, not just one monopoly, led to technological innovation. And the term creative destruction, which Joseph Schumpeter coined, is constantly misused to mean going out of business, right? That, you know, or industry is replaced. He defined it as industrial mutation. So you have Apple and Google competing with cell phones, and then each of them is trying to invest in some completely new technology, like maybe chips in your brain or something, that will completely destroy the cell phone industry and replace it entirely. So I think we can agree on competitive oligopoly, maybe in the national interest. And in fact, the Defense Department during the Cold War, it made sure that you did not have a complete consolidation of defense contractors. And they also encouraged R&D by compelling defense contractors to pool their patents. So they would not be all locked up and they could share the benefits of innovation.
So real quick, what was that process between, let's say, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, we had maybe like 50 or 100 defense contractors, and then it's whittled down to 3 or 4 now?
Well, after the end of the Cold War, the defense secretary for Bill Clinton.
What's his name? Yeah,
Perry.
The Last Supper.
Perry, yeah, the Last Supper, right?
Assistant, undersecretary, anyway.
Yeah, he said we're rapidly reducing military spending. The only way you can survive is to consolidate. And John Kenneth Galbraith, back in the 50s or 60s, he argued that we ought to go back to the arsenal system. This is state-owned factories. If it's and the military is unique, right? I mean, if you're making nuclear weapons, you know, this isn't something where you can be part civilian and part. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I'd like to weigh in on it. I mean, I'll get to that question in particular, but first, I think we do have to acknowledge that, you know, since the 80s or 79, whatever, we had a very simplistic kind of anti-Brandeisian framework centered only around consumer welfare, which is like, as long as prices are low for consumers, like, you don't have to worry about anything else. And that paradigm, I think, is way too simplistic and has naturally provoked a backlash, which in itself may be a little too simplistic. But I think Michael hit the nail on the head, which the investment question. Are these firms actually reinvesting their profits into R&D, new production, whatever? If they are, then I would say you don't really have a problem. If they are not, then yes, whether it's Defense Department compelling them to do so, which is, you know, a unique situation, or introducing new competition at some level that would force more competitive investment would be a realistic approach. But I think the investment is the key criteria there. The second is that industrial policy is often competition policy. I don't know why Americans have it in their head that industrial policy means picking one like failed, stagnant national champion and throwing a lot of money at it. In Korea, they created 3 auto companies when the Korean auto market could not support one. TSMC did not begin as a national champion monopoly. It arose out of like a shared facility that a bunch of different companies could operate in, and even today, it's not the only Taiwanese semiconductor company. So a lot of industrial policy actually involves creating competition, and that brings to the defense point, which is, one of the things I've learned more about recently is that there is, I think, a very simplistic idea in policy circles that like the choice is either, one Boeing or 15 Boeings or maybe 3 Boeings. But what the Last Supper was about, the government didn't directly say go and consolidate. What they said was you're going to have to be defense specialists now. Your company will be a defense company. Before that, GM had a major every major U.S. company had a defense division, because of course it doesn't make sense for a mom and pop company can't participate in making an F-35, but it is kind of other large companies could have major defense divisions that could compete with each other more realistically, and would be a better opportunity for the Defense Department procurement and all of that. And I do think that there's an interesting question there as we go forward. Google, there's only so much R&D they can throw at search. But if you start building,
they make it a little bit worse every year. It costs a lot of money to make it a little bit worse every year.
But if you start building semiconductors, if you start, doing major capital-intensive defense production and things like that, rebuilding the pre-1990s defense industrial base doesn't mean 15 Boeings. It actually means many large companies with actually defense divisions rather than 5 specialized defense companies.
Well, why couldn't you go back to the arsenal system we had from the Washington administration up until World War II, where the services was the Army and the Navy, had their own factories and their own shipyards because there was no civilian market for this between wars. But then during wartime, you contracted out. That's when you got defense contractors. And it seems to me that would fit your scenario, right? So that...
Well, I mean, Trump has bought 10% of Intel, so he's got another 90% to go.
Yeah. How do you see it different in the non-defense space? So let's say like energy, for example.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge too. You can have a Springfield armory, but having a Springfield wire harness factory that only 10% of its products are sold to the Pentagon gets tricky. And can that company actually compete at the forefront without participating in the consumer market? I think that's the limitation of the arsenal system.
Well, as a Texan, I have to say I think that the U.S. benefited from the oil and gas cartels in the 20th century. And that deregulation and having spot markets, I think this was a mistake. That is, from the Roosevelt administration, the 1930s onwards, the U.S. Bureau of Mines, along with the Texas Railroad Commission, more or less illegally set the price of oil in the United States. And then the Seven Sisters, these global corporations, including British Petroleum and a few others, it was a cartel. They set the oil price. I think that when it comes to critical energy and critical minerals, you do not want a constantly fluctuating market, because if you're a manufacturer, you want to have long-term stability. Now, once these things, for example, gas was separate. Natural gas was separately regulated, but up until fairly recently, it could not be exported. Well, why was that? It's a conscious decision half a century ago or more that you wanted cheap natural gas for American manufacturers. It was industrial policy. And the natural gas companies say, well, if we can export gas, we can make more of a profit. Yes, but then the world price goes up, right, at the expense of these gas-dependent American manufacturers. So, when we're talking about immigration, it's not the only input. Labor cost is not the only input in domestic manufacturing. It's also land, raw materials, energy. And in the heyday of American developmentalism, as it's best to describe the system, from World War II up until neoliberalism in the 80s and 90s, they thought about this, and policymakers in both parties. There were stockpiles of raw materials, and the purpose of the stockpile was to prevent wild fluctuations. We still have the petroleum reserve, right? But it was to prevent these wild fluctuations in inputs to manufacturing. So once you decide as a nation that you want certain manufacturing sectors to be able to invest in long-term 30, 50-year investments, then you have to think about the stability of prices of the inputs.
Yeah, I think Julius hit the nail on the head when he just sort of went back to the point about consumer welfare, that, there's a very interesting discussion to be had on the nuances of what this should look like. What has happened on the right of center, and in certain facets of the left center also, is finally an acknowledgement that a pure consumer welfare, the point of all of this, humanity is merely to deliver things at low prices, is not a good way to analyze the economy. And once you get off of that, then you can have this much more interesting discussion about where do you or don't you want different kinds of competition? What other kinds of regulation play a role? What does industrial policy play? It's the same when you're thinking about developmentalism. It's the same when you're thinking about trade. It's the same when you're thinking about immigration. Virtually every argument we've become so accustomed to over the last 20 or 30 years that certain people still think is the trump card slam dunk argument is just, well, doing it this way makes the price lower. And at least in the short run, they're typically correct about that. But they're not even correct about the price being lower in the long run, let alone everything else we might care about. And so I think the flip side, which is so interesting, is as soon as you're willing to admit that you care about other things, all of those slam dunk arguments are just incoherent. They do not work. And it I think has led to now a much more interesting set of debates.
And I think this question is a good one to kind of tie things together. I mean, this question of what ends are we striving for? Is there more than just GDP? What are the cultural ends? There's a number of other ends that we could pursue as a nation. And I feel like there's a difficulty addressing or talking about them or setting those forth. I'm wondering, we're approaching America's 250th anniversary next summer on the 4th of July. Michael, again, I want to kind of turn to you to round things out. If you go back to Alexander Hamilton and kind of this Hamiltonian vision, he wrote the report on manufacturers. One of the first bills that Washington signed was a tariff bill. You see this Hamiltonian school of thought kind of pick up with Henry Clay. You see Lincoln kind of embrace it. This was sort of the playbook of the Republican Party, all the way to Calvin Coolidge. Even in the 1950s, ISI's first donor, J. Howard Pugh, I discovered kind of looking at kind of his historic records, actually had this whole fight where he got really upset at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, which he was also on the board of, because they published a pro-free trade pamphlet. And this issue was so, he was a big he was a free market guy all the way. It was opposed to the New Deal, but kind of this protection of American industry was so critical to him, he actually left the board of FEE over that issue. So I want to, when we're thinking about ends, when we're thinking about kind of the vision that not all the American founders, but let's say that Hamiltonian vision, what ends in terms of political economy do they set forth for the American nation?
Well, I think Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians and Brandeisians and Schumpeterians, they all agree you want a society where you have mass prosperity that's widely shared, where you have a high degree of liberty in the economy and personal freedom and so on. I mean, this is not Prussia, it's not Sparta, but at the same time, the disagreement is in a world of competitive great powers, where the others do not have our interests at heart necessarily. Then you have to supplement the American way of life. A precondition for that, you have to compete with these other powers on the same terms, which I like to think of as the slogan of the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Rich country, strong army. So once you have rich country, strong army, the rich country can be a flourishing, pluralistic democracy. It can be a totalitarian police state. It can be a Codillo-run oligarchy. But that is the precondition. Unless you're going to be a weak country a poor country without a strong army, in which case you will be either incorporated or subordinated to the great powers. So to me, and that was the norm through history with all would-be great powers, regardless of their form of government. I think in the late 20th century, the libertarians rewrote history, and I include the academic neoclassical economists. So and they went back to Adam Smith And they said, well, they had this illusory doctrine, this foolish protectionist mercantilism, right? And they were trying to accumulate gold bullion. And then Adam Smith came along and said, no, the consumer, is although Smith was practical, but my view of history is that developmentalism, which it could also be called developmental capitalism, but it also includes public enterprise and nonprofits and so on, that has been the norm in the West from the Renaissance city-states, and then early modern kingdoms and empires like Britain and France picked it up, and then the U.S. copied the European mercantilists. There were these two heresies in the 1840s and 50s, Marxist socialism and classical liberalism of Cobden and Bright, not the nuanced Adam Smith approach, but free trade is the international law of God. That's what the Cobdenites said. And we now are in a situation where Marxist socialism failed. And I think Cobdenite liberalism has failed. These were both offshoots. They were attacks on the mainstream of Western development, which was this developmentalist or mercantilist system. It's not the way we're taught in schools, right? But I think that's where we are in history. We're seeing the more or less concurrent failure of socialism and of neoliberalism or radical liberalism at the same time. And by default, we're actually returning to the mainstream, not only of American economic history, but of world economic history.
And can you just unpack a little bit more Hamilton specifically and how he saw kind of the American system as going hand in hand with our sort of Republican form of government?
Well, Hamilton, initially, he was actually very concerned with keeping the majority of agrarians happy. So if you read his writings on this, right, he's reassuring them, we will still be a nation of citizen farmers and all of this, but we'll benefit in defense, and then there will be a home market for manufacturers and so on. So I think the real shift in the Hamiltonian tradition, if you want to call it that, takes place in the 20th century when it's no longer a nation of small farmers, right, where there's this flourishing family farmer sector, not plantations. And it coexists with the manufacturers. When a majority of Americans become industrial or service sector workers living in cities, that's when there's a mutation in this system. And I keep coming back to organized labor, but that was when that becomes important, because you can have this Hamiltonian developmentalist approach, which was very successful between the Civil War and Reconstruction in the 1930s, but it left out two large groups, family farmers who became agrarian rebels, and industrial workers. So there are authoritarian anti-worker, anti-family models of this, right? If the Nazis had survived, their plan was to plunder other countries and have slave labor, but it would have been, it wasn't socialism. I mean, it was like an authoritarian version of this neo-mercantilism or developmentalism. So I think the big question in the United States is today, there are two questions. One is, do we go back to seeing government and industry, particularly the tech industry, as natural collaborators, right, instead of rivals? And I think we're moving in that direction. The other debate, which really hasn't even started, is should this be bipartisan? Do we need an industrial policy and development policy based on government-business collaboration without workers at their expense if necessary? Or should it be tripartisan, right? That is, should representatives of labor in some capacity be part of this program of national development? And I don't think that debate has really started yet.
Thank you for watching Project Cosmos, Conversations on the Future of Civilization, which is a production of ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. If you're a student, professor, or lifelong learner who wants to get more involved with ISI, visit isi.org or follow us on social media to learn more about our educational programs that teach the foundations of Western and American civilization and what it means to be a great and good man or woman today. That's isi.org, or like and follow us on social media. Thank you.